I don't think he's exacerbated it in the sense that he's made the war more intense or more dangerous. He's just kept the war going because he's been unwilling to pull the plug on the Ukrainians.
So recently, John Mearsheimer went on Andrew Napolitano's podcast and blasted Trump for refusing to pull the plug on the Ukrainians. Nevertheless, Mearsheimer does think that Trump is backing away to some extent from the Ukraine theater from a U.S. perspective, but it's not in the way that all of us would love. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Well, if you look at what's been reported about this meeting in Paris, it seems that if anything, Trump has given the Europeans hope that the Americans will work with the Europeans to put sanctions on Russia. Sanctions work. So you don't see any evidence that Trump is cutting in the other direction, at least in terms of the meeting today. But with Trump, who can tell from day to day where he stands on these issues?
Is he back to saying what he thinks his audience wants to hear?
Oh, I think he does that all the time. And I think he's constantly throwing the Europeans a bone. He never makes any firm commitments, and he never does anything concrete these days. But he hints to them that he's with them and that he's going to help put pressure on the Russians and get the Russians to make concessions. And then we're going to get a final deal, and we're all going to live happily ever after.
Well, this is a fairy tale, isn't it?
Yeah, it's delusional. If anything, if you look at what the Europeans were saying at this meeting in Paris today, they are clearly doubling down. They are making no concessions whatsoever to the Russians. They're talking basically about creating a 1 million-man Ukrainian army that is really well manned. They're talking about giving the Ukrainians long-range missiles that can strike into Russia, or allowing Ukraine to build missiles indigenously that can hit Russia. And they're talking about putting European troops in Ukraine. So if anything, the Europeans and the Ukrainians are doubling down.
And just think about that. I want no part of anything, whatever that is, of putting boots on the ground in Ukraine versus Russia. This is preposterous. This is something that's America last. To even be hanging around this long is totally America last. And he's right, Trump is doubling down on telling the Europeans he's there to support them with the sanctions regime, and not only against Russia, with trade partners that could have been viable geopolitical partners like India, that he slapped a 50% secondary tariff on, a country that has amazing influence in the world and was actually close to the Trump administration in Trump's first term. Modi said glowing things about Trump as early as a few months ago. Just check out Lex Friedman's recent podcast with him, maybe from a few months ago. Modi and Trump were on good terms. So for Trump to do this is pushing India in the direction of BRICS, in the direction of China and Russia, unnecessarily so. It's probably one of the stupidest things he's done in regard to foreign policy this term. I just can't say enough about how undercovered that story is, pushing a potential trade partner and ally away for the sake of this stupid war versus Russia. He also is talking security guarantees, something that would make any kind of peace arrangement with Russia a non-starter. So this war is going to continue, in my estimation.
And sending a message to the Russians that there's not going to be any compromise. And of course, we know full well that the Russians are not going to compromise. So there's not going to be any deal here.
Don't the Europeans recognize how the Ukrainian military's backs are to a wall, so to speak, how far advanced the Russian military has gone, how close President Putin is to achieving his goals there? Don't they recognize that?
You would certainly think so. I find it hard to believe that they don't. But the counter story is that they believe all these news reports that the Russians are suffering much greater casualties than the Ukrainians, and that the Russian economy is really in deep trouble. And if we can just get more sanctions on them, that economy will crash. I think they're telling themselves stories like that. Otherwise, you would think that they would understand that Ukraine is in desperate straits, which
Yeah, with over 1 million deaths in Ukraine, depending on which statistics you trust, I've seen it as high as, like 1.5 million Ukrainians dead and a few 100,000 Russians, if that, are dead in this war. It's like telling yourself, if you're a serial killer locked behind bars, no, I did not commit these murders. Telling yourself that over dozens of years in a row, eventually believing that it's true, that these propaganda stories that are designed to keep men dying in this fruitless, senseless war are true. I think that's what we're seeing from our European partners right now. That is absurd, and it's something that isn't substantiated by any of the data, but a lot of the real data is shielded from coming into the U.S. because the U.S. only gets the Ukrainian side of the propaganda, which is the NATO side of the propaganda, and NATO happens to be the U.S. empire's military empire-building wing in Europe.
it is.
Here's an interesting comment that President Putin made just the other day. This may have been in Beijing or it may have been in Vladivostok. He was at or about to go to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, but this is a fascinating comment about the early days of the war, and he's talking about when his troops were very close to Kyiv, when, how, and why, and under what circumstances he removed them, and what the Ukrainian response to that was. It's only about 30 seconds. Chris, cut number 2.
And after we, at the insistent urging of our Western European colleagues, withdrew our troops from Kyiv, the situation immediately changed, and we were told, almost verbatim, "Now we will fight until either you tear our heads off or we tear yours off." I don't remember whether I've ever said this publicly or not, but that's roughly how it sounded. Only in cruder terms, but quite openly, and oddly enough, in a sort of comradely way. So now it's either us or you. Well, and this all continues.
For the record, this is true. Whatever you think of Putin, that is true. They had troops within the vicinity of Kyiv itself and withdrew them because they believed that the peace process going on at that time, I believe it was in April of 2022, in Istanbul was going to proceed in kind. He believed that, his negotiating partner Zelensky was going to sign on into that peace agreement, which, by the way, didn't maintain Russian control of the Donbass. It would have enforced the Minsk Accords and given those regions autonomy like was called for in Minsk II, and Russia withdrew their troops from that region in good faith, regardless of what you think about his invasion or the war in general from 2014 on, the U.S. overthrow of the Yanukovych government, etc. That is true.
Wow. What do you think?
I think it's hardly surprising. You want to remember that when the war first started and negotiations were taking place in Istanbul,
Right.
The West asked Putin if he would remove his troops from the Kyiv area, and the argument was that for purposes of facilitating negotiations, it would be a sign of good. It would be a good gesture, a positive gesture, a sign of goodwill, if the Russians got those troops away from Kyiv. And Putin did remove them from Kyiv because he believed at the time that the Istanbul negotiations were making great progress. They would probably end up with a deal, and he wanted to do everything he could to facilitate it.
And all the news at the time was that they had signed on to this deal, that the Ukrainians signed on to it, but the U.S. and Boris Johnson talked him out of that to keep this war going for the sake of the military-industrial complex and antagonizing tensions with Russia. And here we are 3.5 years later.
And of course, those troops were then removed, and the end result was that the negotiations broke down because the West was not interested in negotiations. Troops had been removed.
But it's very interesting, Professor Mearsheimer, that President Putin relates this rather crude threat. I doubt that it was made to his face. It must have been made through diplomatic channels. We'll tear your heads off.
Yeah.
I mean, this is And he said it was even cruder than that. So who knows exactly what the language was and how it would be translated into English. How has Trump exacerbated the war in Ukraine?
Well, he's exacerbated it in the sense that he's not put an end to it. He's facilitated the continuation of the war. I don't think he's exacerbated it in the sense that he's made the war more intense or more dangerous. He's just kept the war going because he's been unwilling to pull the plug on the Ukrainians. He's worked out this arrangement where we no longer are going to give weapons directly to the Ukrainians. The Europeans are going to buy weapons from us. They're going to pay for those weapons. And then the Europeans are going to give our weapons to Ukraine.
So this is still stupid. This is Lend-Lease from World War II, prior to World War II. This is a proxy war designed to inflame tensions with Russia and keep those tensions going, even beyond when they try to propagandize that the U.S. isn't involved in that theater. It just instead of a proxy war with Russia, this becomes a proxy war, where the same war is still being fought between the US and Russia. Instead of one layer between them, though, that's Ukraine, there would be two layers between them, Ukraine and European allies, right? So this is stupid. It's an imbecilic policy. It's a policy I don't want to see whatsoever. I want to see the US withdraw all aid to Ukraine and prohibit its bombs from being used against Russia. If that continues, even as a proxy war, even if the U.S. is paid, Russia's not going to want warm relations with the United States. This is not then a viable trading partner and a partner that can work out peaceful relations with the U.S., and that's the sincere desire of us that want peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations and entangling alliances with none, including Ukraine.
Is the deal that he's worked out. But he's not cut off the flow of U.S. weapons to Ukraine. They're just going through a middleman at this point in time.
Has the U.S. begun to receive the flow of European cash, or is there no European cash? Are these weapons being bought on credit?
I'm not sure there, but I am quite certain that the Europeans will end up paying for those weapons, and the Ukrainians as well will end up paying for those weapons. Although I think in the Ukrainian case, the Europeans will give lots of their own money to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians will use that money to buy weaponry from the United States. But I think Trump is deeply committed to not spending much more money on Ukraine and letting the Ukrainians and the Europeans pick up the bill.
Well, I sure hope he's right about that. I've seen no indication of that, really. The spigot of money continues with only, the abatement of something like 6 or 7 days back in, what was that, late February, early March, where they had that spat in the White House, and aid was withdrawn for a few days and restored. Since then, it's just been a constant flow of intelligence and aid. And in most of the ways, I do agree with Mearsheimer. Trump hasn't expressly escalated this war. He's kept it going, but he did, boast about deploying nuclear submarines. So in a way, you can argue that's an escalation. Has the ability to bring about World War III and a nuclear holocaust, something we don't exactly want.
I guess he's also deeply committed to the military-industrial complex. He wants that flow to continue. I mean, he could stop all of this in a couple of weeks if he just said, no more arms, no more U.S. arms, no matter who's paying for them.
Well, I think what Trump really wants to see is us continue to build lots of arms, but not use them in Ukraine. Use them for our own purposes and use them for Israel's purposes. I think that's his principal interest for continuing to build arms.
Yeah, isn't that reassuring? Well, we don't want to build up arms for the sake of the Ukrainians. We just want to build up arms for the sake of the Israelis. This America last mentality is so pervasive, regardless of who you elect to be president, even if they run under a vehicle of America first, of drain the swamp, of general non-interventionism. to focus inwardly, to prioritize domestic concerns, and it's all about Ukraine and Israel. So it wouldn't be much of a relief to take those weapons being dedicated to Ukraine and rededicate them to Netanyahu, who is in the process of enacting a genocide in Gaza, by the way, and in the process of expanding Israel's borders and trying to under the Greater Israel Project and expanding the West Bank settlements into Lebanon and Syria. He just, assassinated the prime minister of Yemen, by the way. Imagine if Russia had done that to, say, mayors in Germany. I think that would have gotten a lot more media attention. I think that would have been decried as a criminal act, an act of war. You'd see clamor for a hot war versus Russia if that happened, clearly against international law, clearly against any semblance of justice, and clearly something that the U.S. would have gotten involved in. But the U.S. is staying silent on that, just as they always are, for whatever evil deed Netanyahu and the Israeli government wants to unveil at that point. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below. Is Mearsheimer right about this? Is the war going to continue in Ukraine for much longer? Is Trump just going to turn it into a proxy war where the weapons go through Europe on the way to Ukraine as a middleman? What's going to happen? And is the security guarantees just a method, talking about those, to prolong this war? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Judge Napolitano, and please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel, and in return, I'll give you access to all of my videos before they go live to the general public on my channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.